All right, let's dive right into this explainer. Today, we're unpacking something absolutely staggering: how China literally went from the brink of total collapse to a global superpower in just 4 decades. I mean, today, it's undeniably one of the most powerful countries on the planet, but, it definitely wasn't always that way. We're going to map out exactly how a broken nation transformed into this economic juggernaut that literally shapes our global supply chains and builds the very devices you and I use every single day.
The sheer scale of this economic rescue mission is, honestly, it's kind of hard to wrap your head around. Just 40 years ago, the poverty rate in China was sitting at over 90%. Starvation was rampant. But fast forward to today, that rate has completely plummeted to less than 1%. And over those same few decades, China grew so fast that it now contributes more than 18% of the entire global GDP, making it the second largest economy in the world. So, looking at numbers like that, it really forces us to ask the ultimate question, right? What was the magic here? How exactly did one of the world's poorest, most broken countries pull off an almost impossible feat in such a remarkably short amount of time? Well, to understand the mechanics of this transformation, we actually need to rewind a bit and look at the foundation of the nation itself.
And what's super fascinating is just the origin of the country's name. Locals actually call their nation Zhongguo, which translates to the Middle Kingdom, symbolizing a 4,000-year history where they saw themselves as the literal center of the world. But the name China that we use, that comes from the 2,000-year-old Qin dynasty. And here's a fun fact: that same dynasty actually inspired the Hindi word for refined white sugar, chini, since it's believed to have been brought to India by the Chinese. It's a sweet piece of trivia, but as we'll see, the history that followed was anything but sweet. To truly understand their modern economic rise, we first have to witness a devastating era known as the Century of Humiliation. Starting back in 1839, China endured a brutal period of foreign looting. The British forced opium into the country, which absolutely destroyed society with mass addiction. And this was just followed by the incredibly bloody Taiping Rebellion, wars with Japan, and the horrific casualties of World War II, where around 30 million Chinese people were killed. This grueling century of chaos only finally ended in 1949, when the Chinese Communist Party won a civil war and Mao Zedong formed the People's Republic of China.
Now this brings us to a pretty dark chapter: Mao's Great Leap Backward and the severe consequences of absolute centralized control. Back in 1958, Mao launched a massive campaign that was meant to push the country forward, but unfortunately it did the exact opposite.
The idea was to drive rapid transformation by completely abolishing private farming. Mao stripped landowners of their property and put all agricultural land strictly in the hands of the government. At the same time, to force industrialization, the government actually ordered ordinary citizens to build small-scale steel furnaces right in their backyards. I mean, imagine being forced to melt down your own cooking pots to make useless steel at home. The result? Without private ownership, farmers entirely lost the incentive to work hard. The backyard steel was of terrible quality, wasting massive resources, and ultimately, between 1958 and 1961, grain production plummeted by a catastrophic 15%.
And here's the thing about dictatorships: because they operate without any checks and balances, ideas get pushed through without any real-world testing. A really tragic example is the Sparrow Extermination Campaign. Mao basically ordered the killing of all sparrows simply because he believed they were eating too much grain. Well, the tragic result of that? With the birds gone, insect populations completely exploded. They multiplied uncontrollably and ended up eating way more crops than the birds ever did. This ecological collapse triggered a horrific famine that killed an estimated 20 to 40 million people.
Refusing to admit these policy failures, Mao then launched the Cultural Revolution in 1966 to crush political opposition. He essentially weaponized students, mobilizing them into civilian armies known as the Red Guards. These loyalists shut down schools, destroyed historical artifacts, and violently publicly humiliated intellectuals and party officials who disagreed with Mao, including, notably, a high-ranking official named Deng Xiaoping. Before the Red Guards were finally stopped, this chaos claimed up to 2 million lives, which brings the total estimated death toll under Mao's various policies to a staggering 50 million people.
Now, to look at this impartially, that era did leave behind a few foundational achievements that became critical later on. The government launched a massive nationwide public education system, completely tripling the number of primary and secondary schools by 1978 and drastically cutting illiteracy rates. Plus, a 1950 marriage law completely outlawed forced and arranged marriages. This gave women the right to divorce and brought them onto a much more equal footing in society.
Okay, moving forward, we get to Deng's pragmatic economic pivot, introducing socialism with Chinese characteristics. Following Mao's death in 1976, Deng Xiaoping, yeah, the very man targeted by the Red Guards earlier, actually comes to power. He recognized right away that tight government control had absolutely devastated the economy, so he started the highly pragmatic process of freeing it up.
The way Deng executed this is absolutely fascinating. He used the household and factory responsibility systems. So, the government still owned the land, sure, but they leased it to individual farmers and factory workers long-term. And here was the genius three-step mechanic. First, you secure the lease. Second, you produce enough to meet your set government quota. But third, and this is the game changer, anything you produce over that quota, you can sell wherever you want for your own personal profit. Just like that, the incentive to work hard and innovate was completely back.
This surge of local empowerment birthed what were called Township and Village Enterprises, or TVEs. Basically, these were rural businesses owned by the local townships, and they were massively successful. By the early 90s, they had generated 100 million jobs, seriously shrinking the wealth gap between the countryside and the cities. You've probably heard of, or even owned devices from, global tech giants like Huawei, right? Well, they actually started out as exactly this, a local township and village enterprise.
Building on that incredible rural momentum, Deng's next move was looking outward. In 1980, he established Special Economic Zones, or SEZs. These were designated hotspots where the government slashed red tape, reduced regulations, and offered super aggressive tax incentives just to attract foreign businesses. Shenzhen is the most famous example. It went from a sleepy little fishing village with a $300 million GDP in 1980 to a jaw-dropping $420 billion international megacity by 2020. Absolutely wild.
All of this was part of Deng's open door policy, a massive economic liberalization that basically rolled out the welcome mat for the world, and it worked perfectly. Huge companies like Apple, Nike, and Volkswagen flooded in, setting up the infrastructure that directly produces the stuff we wear and the tech we rely on today. By 2021, China's foreign direct investment skyrocketed to over $333 billion.
But here's the catch with that kind of growth. Foreign companies only invest that kind of massive cash if there is a highly skilled workforce ready to hit the ground running. You can't just build factories, right? You have to build mines. Recognizing this, the government poured strategic investments into STEM, science, technology, engineering, and math, and they heavily prioritized technical and vocational education so their workers had real practical skills.
To put that into perspective, when we neutrally compare China's strategy against a neighbor like India, the timeline really speaks volumes. China brought in a compulsory, free, 9-year education law way back in 1986 and consistently pumped up their education budget. India, on the other hand, didn't introduce their Right to Education Act until 2009. We see the exact same trend in health spending. The result of China's early focus on human capital? Today, they boast a literacy rate of over 95% compared to India's 77%. That highly educated workforce was the literal engine of their industrial boom.
And the economic result of those differing timelines is staggering. In 1990, India actually had a slightly higher GDP per capita than China, but because of China's aggressive reforms, infrastructure development, and intense education spending, they completely flipped the script. Today, China's GDP per capita sits at over $17,000. That is nearly 3 times that of India.
What makes this entire economic rise so fascinating is the methodology behind it. Deng Xiaoping famously described his approach to economic reform as, quote, crossing the river by feeling the stones. So instead of abruptly forcing top-down, untested mandates like Mao did, Deng was highly pragmatic. Policies were rolled out super gradually, evaluated locally at every single step, and tweaked based on real-world results before they ever got expanded.
However, we definitely have to address the much darker side of this story, the cost of dictatorship, and the very real limits of economic freedom without political freedom. Because while Deng Xiaoping enthusiastically opened up the economy and gave citizens financial freedom, he made a very deliberate choice to maintain a harsh political dictatorship. He could have transitioned the country into a democracy, but he flat out chose not to.
By refusing to allow political freedom, Deng set a really dangerous precedent. This unyielding authoritarian stance directly led to the tragic 1989 Tiananmen Square massacre. It also meant that rapid industrialization was shoved through without any democratic and environmental checks, leading to severe ecological damage. Fast forward to today, and that same unchecked system allowed modern leader Xi Jinping to impose massive, severe lockdowns during the pandemic, proving that the grip of authoritarianism has only returned stronger. Which leaves us with a truly fascinating paradox to end on.
We've just seen how localized freedom, private incentives, and heavy education investments literally pulled hundreds of millions out of poverty and built a global economic superpower. But as the state continues to tighten its strict authoritarian grip on the daily lives of its people, we have to ask, can a nation maintain this miraculous pace of true innovation